The Ukraine Peace Summit. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky arrived in Zurich a day early for the meeting. Many world leaders will join to discuss ways to end Russia's war on Ukraine. Russia was not invited, but President Vladimir Putin still laid out his conditions for peace. One, for Ukraine to surrender 4 regions now claimed by Russia, and 2, for Ukraine to abandon its bid to join NATO. The offer was quickly rejected. Yuliya Kovaliv is Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, and she joins me now. Ambassador, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for inviting.
The Peace Summit begins tomorrow with at least 90 countries in attendance, but I want to start with what happened at the G7. $50 billion in a loan to Ukraine to help with its defense on Russia, and defense agreements signed with countries such as the US and Japan. How does that help your country?
First of all, indeed, that was a very important decision with G7 summit that actually the income on the frozen Russian assets, and we know that there are around 300 billion of Russian assets in the Western countries which have been frozen since the start of the full-scale invasion. Now the G7 endorsed in their statement and during the meeting that the 50 billion of the income of these assets will be transferred to Ukraine. And of course, we welcome this decision because it's not only just and fair that Russia need to pay for all of the damages that they caused in Ukraine. And I would like to remind that overall damage to Ukraine caused by Russia and its aggression exceeds $400 billion. So this is a very right step, and I would like to thank you and acknowledge the important, and I would say the leading role of Canada in this discussion among G7, and Canada was the first country to adopt the legislation that allows seizing Russian assets, including Russian sovereign assets, and a strong voice and advocacy by Canada, by Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. So we are have this package, which will also both help us as a country to address the financial challenges, to address and will be able to support our military, but also to rebuild the critical infrastructure which was damaged by Russians.
It took a while to get to even this point, right? There was a lot of reluctance to touch the assets of the Russian central bank. People feared retaliation, withdrawal of assets from other countries, from Western banks, and destabilizing the financial system. But other countries like Estonia and others said, forget just using the interest. Let's seize the assets entirely and give that to Ukraine to pay for the rebuilding. Do you think the G7 will ever get to that point?
We started back in 2022 with many countries who said that this is a no-go option. And Canada was kind of an icebreaker in this discussion because, as I've said, you were the first country to adopt this legislation and show the example to other G7 countries that it could be done, it could be as an option, and that, of course, helped a lot. And indeed, we have this proverb in Ukraine that, the path can be completed only when you walk step by step there. It's an important step, but of course the key goal is Russia to completely pay for all of the damages, and that could be done by actually seizing Russian assets, and we will continue to work with our partners to get to this.
Okay, so the next step is the movement to Switzerland for the peace conference. Russia isn't going to be there. How meaningful can a peace conference be without the other party to the conflict, the people who started this, that you need to eventually find a way to end the conflict with?
Of course, it's a very important summit. It's the first inauguration peace summit, which will have the confirmed participation of 100 both countries and international institutions, 92 countries on the level of leaders, of the ministers of foreign affairs will be represented there, including a lot of countries from the global south. So all the continents will be represented there, and plus UN and the other international organizations. And it's a very important discussion with the like-minded countries, the countries wherever they are, small or big in terms of their territory, economic development, or military power, because that's what unites all of us, is that we can all develop, we can all serve the citizens of the countries only based on rule-based order, because this is something what secure our borders, secure our people, and the main topics of the Peace Summit will be the food security, which is universal, for many countries, and we all back then in 2022 saw the horror and the risks for the global food security with Russia blocking Black Sea port, nuclear security. Undoubtedly, this is the crucial for all of the peace order and the humanitarian aspect of the world.
You mentioned that we'll be well attended and well represented by countries from the global south. This is an important constituency in this because Europe is very clearly aligned with Ukraine in this fight, but the colonial histories of Africa in particular, they didn't necessarily see this conflict in the same way that, say, Britain and France and Germany viewed it. And they are feeling the food crisis brought on by the invasion of your country. But Russian propaganda plays a big role in places such as Africa in particular, where Russia is very active. How important is it to have their attendance there to try to bring them on side? Because Russia has been courting a lot of the nations in the global south aggressively.
Indeed, it's very important. For the last 2 years, Ukrainian diplomatic efforts, together with all of our allies, was also working closely with the countries on the African continent. We as Ukraine significantly increased our diplomatic presence in African countries by opening the new embassies, by also our Grain from Ukraine initiative, which was supported by Canada and many other countries, where Ukraine was delivering grain to many of the most vulnerable countries in Africa, like as a humanitarian support, to also show them that for us Ukrainians, the nation who survived through Holodomor, the artificial famine orchestrated by Stalin regime, we understand, in our DNA, how important the food security is and what could be a consequence when when Russia tries to use again food as a weapon.
The attendance will be large, but some of the large players will not be in attendance. Russia, as I said, China as well. The United States will be there, but President Joe Biden will not. He's going to a fundraiser in the United States because of the election year. Does that limit the ability to make the sort of progress you're hoping for here if the big global players, such as China, Russia, and the president himself won't be in Switzerland?
It's important to understand that the big representation that will be in Switzerland tonight and tomorrow gives an understanding on how many countries really understand what's at stake. And it's not only in Europe, it's not only within the European Union or European continent. The consequences of this war were very strongly felt in all of the other parts of the world. If we are looking overall on the consequences of Russian full-scale invasion, I would also mention the historical bilateral security agreement which Ukraine just signed with Japan. This is the first country from Indo-Pacific region, which is traditionally was not so much involved with Ukraine, and I would stress that this is the historic step between our countries and also between building relations of Ukraine and Indo-Pacific region. Just last week, President Zelensky was in a big defense conference in Singapore. He was also visiting Philippines. So what Ukraine is explaining to all parts of the world, that if we won't be able to secure the rule-based order, if we won't be able to live based on the UN Charter, there is no region that can feel safe.
Yeah, and Japan is interesting how their foreign policy has changed by this. They've been going to NATO meetings, for example, even though they're not in the North Atlantic. But just, I guess as a final point, I mean, Vladimir Putin put this peace offer on the table, calling for your country, I think it's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, essentially surrender massive amounts of territory, some of which Ukraine still occupies. But at the same time, because the
Russia occupies.
Oh, sorry, that's right. My apologies. But at the same time, Secretary General Stoltenberg talked about the slow delivery of military equipment and the challenges that is causing for Ukraine on the battlefield. And you've now taken to conscripting out of prisons convicts to replenish the losses and the energy challenges you felt on the front lines. Where do you see the conflict right now that Russia is making a demand that is clearly unacceptable to your country, but the slow delivery and this change in your conscription policy, where are things?
First of all, Putin, as always, trying to manipulate, and if we look precisely on the timing, he delivered this message just on the eve of the peace summit. But we also were much aware of a lot of efforts that Putin and his regime was trying to destroy the peace summit. So trying to persuade many leaders around the world not to come to the peace summit. And definitely when we see the and wide representation of the many countries in Switzerland on the peace summit, they once again failed. Another thing is like when Putin was saying all this nonsense, he's continuously saying, the same time there were over 31 missiles flying on Ukraine territory, hitting once again civilian infrastructure. Of course, and that's why the importance of the air defense and the urgency of the supply of the air defense is on the top priority, both with the meetings of the NATO defense ministers, the G7 discussion, that Germany is taking the lead to build a coalition for the air defense of Ukraine. And we are grateful for yesterday's announcement of Minister Blair of another package of the military support. I visited just a month ago the facility that produced the armored vehicles that Canada is providing to Ukraine. And I am sincerely thankful for Canadians and the people I met who work, as they told me, for the purpose. Because this is the equipment that really helps Ukraine to save the lives, both our soldiers, civilians, by standing firm against Russian attacks. And Ukraine, we understand, back from 2014, when Putin illegally occupied Crimea and eastern regions, that we need to restore our territorial integrity. Otherwise, Putin will continue, and Ukraine will not be the last country that Putin will try to occupy.
Ambassador Kovaliv, Yuliya Kovaliv, Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, thank you for coming in today.